Hello, welcome to Drugs and Wrapped with me, Rob. Today it's just me and Jamie. Jamie, how are we? You okay?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So what's news?
Well, it's all go on the Western Front, but we're all... we are West, though.
Kinda, yeah.
Oh God. So we're obviously been waiting in anticipation with regards to the reclassification or the classification for NOS, aka laughing gas, to now a Class C. So we're just going to see what the fallout of that's going to be in the future in regards to like the criminality element to it, and also how would that impact anyone coming into services going forward. So that's the big news for me, I think, more recently.
I laugh because it is just quite comical, really, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Like, you know, to see that now is a Class C drug, and you know the criminal element to it now, and how many young people are using the substance. I think more information around the substance is needed to put more effort into that rather than just like, let's just criminalize it and you know put more people's futures at risk. You know, we are very much aware of the health element, the impact on health that it does have, you know, when used in abundance, but we need to be a bit more proactive than what we're actually being at the moment.
But the thing is, they haven't banned it from a harm perspective, though, have they?
No, not at all.
It's purely from an antisocial behaviour,
Yeah.
and like the amount of canisters you find on the street. I don't know about you, but I don't know the last time I saw a canister on the street.
Not the whippet canisters. We've seen the larger canisters more than anything now. Yeah, 100%. Those small silver aluminium canisters have gone a long time ago. Now it's the larger canisters, which I can't remember the sizes that they come in, but they're far more, you know, popular.
Do you see balloons with them as well?
Not so much. Just the empty canisters, which are quite a weight in them actually. I don't know what material they make. You know, obviously it's contain gas, so they have to be quite substantial. But you know, when you see that, you know, the MPs voted overwhelmingly to categorise it at like Class C on what grounds? On antisocial behaviour, you know, really. But we'll see what the ban will do, and whether people now will not come forward to look for help or anything like that.
Yeah, I think we're going to do an episode on probably some point next year to look at if it has had any kind of implications really from the ban. But you see, for me anyway, I see more crisp packets and water bottles, you know, kind
definitely.
of discarded on the street. You're not going to ban them, are you?
No.
So yeah, it'll be an interesting one to see what the actual kind of implications will be. But benzos today, James, is what we're talking about.
That's what I'm here for.
That's what you're here for. The big dog is in the house to talk about benzos. Absolutely. What was your self-proclaimed title, James?
God's favourite drugs worker.
There we are. Fabulous.
Yeah, thank you.
There we are. So in terms of benzos then, I swear we haven't taken laughing gas before this. No. But But in terms of benzos then, so obviously this is a class of sedative substances. I think most people will probably know Valium as the main benzo. So we'll refer to benzodiazepines as benzos. Xanax is probably one of the more well-known ones, but then obviously we've got kind of newer ones that have come on the market, haven't we, which we'll discuss in a bit. In terms of from yourself, obviously you manage the Swansea services, and you've kind of been around in services for a while. From a benzo perspective then, have they always been around?
Yeah. I think we've always had, if you when you triage an individual coming into like our tier 2 street agency, you always kind of could naturally tick a box of whether someone has had a brief experience with it, used them recreationally, or they were their primary drug of choice. And they were they obviously we had scenarios where different settings from they would be prescribed to the individual or prescribed to another, or they were then sold illicitly and were genuine was the actual genuine substance and was sold or palmed off to other people, and you kind of knew they were in the background, and they're so multifunctional. The marketplace is very buoyant across the country, as we know. But with benzos or Valium, diazepam, as we call them over the years, they've always had their place in the drugs market. And obviously, as we go on to discuss, I suppose, you'll see that how the diversification of drug use and people's needs and wants and requirements from a drug, not always benzodiazepines, but you'll see how the drug has got more popular over time and has become more problematic as well.
Why would you say it's become more? Is there a particular reason why they become more popular? Because that's something that I, looking from the outside, really, in terms of not necessarily being frontline in services, but kind of hearing and seeing, Valium use, that it has become more popular over the last few years. Is there any particular reason why you think that is? I
think from a medical perspective, it's their primary function when prescribed is as a sedative. It's got that the hypnotic element to it, anti-anxiety.
I think that's the main reason for its prescription, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Anxiety.
And those and the muscle relaxant elements to it as well, for whatever is required from a medical perspective. From an individual that may be looking for a certain outcome from the drug, because that relaxation element, that opportunity to take away the stresses, the strains of modern life and society, it's got that primed position in the marketplace for individuals to actually look for the substance to use more frequently. Now, there's so many environmental factors now which have changed, which has been a bit of a game changer in relation to benzodiazepine use. And you've got to look at it from back in the day. You would or could get prescription benzodiazepine if you were lucky. Some would be offered it long term, others would be short term. We all know now from the days of where we're very much aware of the long term prescribing becomes non-effective because of individuals' tolerances and the drug loses its effectiveness.
Do that people tend to become dependent then?
Yeah, absolutely. So people become dependent psychologically and physiologically as well. So we've got to be aware of the risks associated to benzodiazepine use as well. And I think what people have got is that the market, as I say, the marketplace was obviously that this drug was always bubbling in the background. It's multifunctional. It has its foot in every camp of whatever tranche of drug use or drug using community you sit in. You've got a use there for it potentially. And it could be therapeutically as well for those people who may have withdrawals or maybe self-medicating in some way, shape or form. But it's got such a broad diversification. And now what we're seeing with all the issues in regards to drug availability, quality, quantity, control, increase in alcohol use, poly drug use, the marketplace, as I said, is primed now for this substance. If in those cases that we do have, it is genuinely, benzodiazepines as well, because that's probably another discussion that we're going to have, is that then the use there can facilitate someone's alleviation of withdrawals from opiates, can be used for self-medicating when it comes to maybe if you've got comorbidity with mental health and drug and alcohol use. You've got the self-prescribing element for treatment for yourself, or when you're maybe a dependent alcohol user. So it's so multifunctional. And if I'm a stimulant user as well,
use it as like
help with the come down, help me get to sleep, help me put my mind at ease, at rest. So the marketplace and the availability and how cheap the drug is nowadays, it's perfect, you know, and that's why we've seen across a broad section of all people coming in are kind of presenting with, you know, many issues. That's not to mention as well, in regards to the diversity of the drug, with the demographics of the people that are presenting.
Okay.
So that's another discussion as well, is that back in the day, you know, we would see people that were, you know, using street drugs but were also using benzodiazepines. Now we're getting people from all walks of life, maybe you know, are working in a professional setting and have also been using benzodiazepines, whether that their initial introduction was through their GP due to having quite a stressful job, or a stressful job and work, you know, that kind of home life as well. So they got introduced to the substance, and they've been self-medicating from there on in. The internet, the availability of prescription medications on the internet, and having the ability to access the internet and the funds to be able to pay for that, we've seen the rise in that. We've also, which is like a small cohort of individuals, and older people, should we say, you know, coming into services asking about information, advice, whereas now they've been taken off prescription benzodiazepine scripts. They've been using the internet to purchase their prescriptions. The reason for that is because they've been self-medicating, because they feel that they've been battling or struggling with like neurodivergency. So they feel they've gone undiagnosed for maybe being on the autistic spectrum, and the challenges that they face day to day in managing their life, interacting socially with family members, people in the community, work. And they said, you know, it's really worked. And now that they've been taken off their prescription, that then they've had to go other places to purchase the drug, whether it be, well, normally it is on the internet, and the prices on the internet have skyrocketed as well. So, you know, that is a big hit to the wallet as well for some individuals that are doing it, and that's causing significant issues. And obviously that's without even talking about tolerance and then building up a dependence on that, and how people can manage it, and how do they, you know, safely use the drug without putting themselves at risk.
So with those like people being prescribed, then is it a case of that they're reporting that their prescription is just being stopped and there's kind of no alternatives that are being offered to them, so that's why they then have to look at getting Valium offline? Or to be fair, what we're seeing is that from a primary care perspective, when prescribing, the GPs have given individuals a kind of reduction plan, so there's not that kind of sudden cessation of like their prescription, and they're obviously following medical guidelines now, which is fantastic, but that doesn't help the person for after that. So we're seeing good practice within primary care for people who have been prescribed it. Also speaking to people within health in certain departments, they've also seen, I think, a bit of an increase in referrals into pain management from primary care into secondary care for those individuals, because they're still then looking for prescription medications. And also we're led to believe that primary care incentivized now to be reducing the amount of people that are being prescribed these medications. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be mindful of the current landscape of prescribing, and also primary care's concerns around the risks attached to people who may be struggling and may have very complex, overlapping, unmet needs that are not met through primary care and are not accessed to, we say, a tier 2 service provision like ourselves,
and how complicated that could be for an individual, and the risks that pose to them. So it's an interesting landscape to be looking at this present moment in time. You know, there are potential alternatives, shall we say, but I think, you know, when you're looking at possibly suggesting CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, which could help with your withdrawal and ongoing road to recovery, sometimes that isn't always, should we say, met with open arms for some individuals who may be, you know, trying to deal with years of potential trauma, and you know, there are alternatives from herbal perspective, you know, beta blockers and things like that, but they're not the same really, are they? But then what you do look at, then you may see an increase in other substances being tried and tested, you know, to be able to support them, to look at their drug use and to help them with, like, you know, whatever lifestyle changes or behavioural strategies that they need to take to be able to cope with that change go forward.
Yeah. When you talk about price, like, what do you know in terms of, like, what is the going rate for Valium nowadays?
Oh, from a street perspective, it's a couple of quid, you know, for one or two you know, for a batch of tablets. You know, I've been told, like, from a manufacturer's perspective, from like your clandestine pharmaceutical outlets, you know, a cost of a tablet is pennies, you know, and then the markup then obviously goes up as it goes down the chain and ends up ending up on a street with, you know, pounds, and because of the demand and the amount they can churn out the tablets, and obviously they don't come always in like blister packs and packaging, they come loose, they come in bags, so you haven't got to worry about those kind of overheads. But the availability then, you know, is much easier from a distribution perspective, and you know, you come away a happy person if you've managed to walk away with X amount or a couple of hundred blue tablets that you can you know, consume in your leisure. But that doesn't say that substance that you're taking is actually you know, benzodiazepine. As we know, not always is that the case when we've managed to get you know, test results back.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main issues, isn't it, in terms of with benzos at the minute, in that people are believing they're getting one thing, but actually they're getting something completely different, in terms of within the benzo family, not necessarily a completely different drug, so to speak. But I think it's quite interesting, like what you said, in terms of the type of people, if you kind of use for a better expression really, but that use kind of benzos, because talking to people, they tend to think of like benzos as a drug that tends to be used by people who use opiates. But actually, like you mentioned, it's so broad, and I think even going back probably 10-15 years ago, it probably wasn't too uncommon for your nan to potentially be dependent upon Valium, and do you know, it's
absolutely.
And obviously we kind of don't, I assume we don't really see that as much anymore, because obviously they, like you mentioned, in terms of the prescribing element, and they've kind of cut that back a little bit, but you know, it is still fairly widely kind of prescribed, isn't it, in terms of that. Going on then, in terms of like, from a services perspective, what are you seeing then in terms of people accessing support around benzos? Is it that we tend to see people who actually come into services wanting support around another drug, but benzos is in the background, or are we kind of seeing people who just use benzos?
I think it's a bit of a mix. It's a bit of everything, to be honest with you. You know, you've now got people who are presenting with like benzos or a substance mimicking benzos as their primary drug of choice. What they are seeking sometimes is like, they would like to be completely refraining from using any form of substances, but the reality of that is sometimes extremely challenging, because if you think like, when you look at someone's drug use and you say like, what do you think are the reasons why you use substances? It's so broad and so varied, and just to name a few things would be, self-medicating due to like anxiety, anxiety, depression, dealing with your thoughts of previous traumas that you experienced. And then when you're talking about someone's trauma, that's extremely varied as well, and how people cope with that is very individual. So when you're looking at the substance, and you've got the substance which then really helps that individual at that time of managing it, but they then sometimes may overuse the drug, because obviously they start to see that their tolerance is increasing, and you've almost come then full spectrum when someone presents at your building and you start working on a reduction plan, and you start looking at moving on in their recovery. They then come full circle to that point when they start experiencing again anxiety, depression, because you've got to remember what that post-acute withdrawal experience that people will kind of like, some individuals will have, which will be lingering around when they're looking at their reduction plan, and it just brings back all those memories and thoughts of why people started using in the first instance, was to avoid that withdrawal element from that acute withdrawal element of benzodiazepines. So it's really kind of difficult and challenging. Like we said, going back to like the cognitive behavioral therapy stuff, is that if you bring in that into play, when you've been so used to being able to have a substance that you can just take and that just goes away, the amount of effort that goes into someone's personal care, self-care, promoting their well-being themselves, when you really sometimes maybe not like yourself or really struggle with that's a real challenge. So the work, our work, I think, is really cut out for us when, as a street agency, when you've got someone who is presenting solely with that issue and potentially without options for treatment, so an alternative prescribing.
Is that available?
It is. However, you got to remember the demands on treatment services are extremely high due to all those other substances, and I think it sometimes involves a lot of planning, a lot of pre-treatment work, relapse prevention work, to kind of really evidence that, how do you say it, that individual is engaging with services and showing that that's what they really want, and if you can evidence that and you can promote that they can access that kind of like treatment then, and alternative detoxification, I suppose, or prescribe, or not prescribing really, the detox, then yes, it is an option, but it's not easily accessible for all, shall we say.
So you can potentially have like a Valium or benzo detox, similar to like an alcohol detox, so to speak. So that potentially is available.
Yeah. And like you say, like as probably a lot of services across the country, they're a tier 2 funded third sector organisation, but predominantly probably seeing a lot of tier 3 cases, and working above their kind of like their tiered
so tier 3 being more clinical,
working with people coming in with like multiple overlapping and unmet needs, more complex comorbidity, possibly needed prescribing, but you've got to think, prescribing is very stretched at the moment, so where do those people sit in this moment in time? And it all depends on where you are in the country and how your waiting lists, waiting times, how proactive treatment services are, and clinicians. So it varies drastically, massively, but those are just some of the few issues. And that's, as you say, just for those individuals, which is quite simple when it got a single drug, but when you got drug users, and the complexities then of detoxification, one drug being swapped with another drug, or there's a multitude of other drugs, and benzos are just one of those thrown in, and which are also is also problematic as well.
So going back in terms of like what you said, James, I think we alluded to it in terms of Valium and benzos but probably Valium more specifically, in that people don't necessarily know what they're getting. Like Wedinos, obviously the drug checking service, which is based in Wales, but it's utilised from people from across the UK. Like I was having a look actually in terms of their last set of annual figures. So I think it was benzodiazepines were the most commonly identified class of substance, basically that the samples that they received to then obviously test. But they said that they basically received what the consumer thought was Valium. They received just over 1,200 samples, and within those samples, upon analysis, once those drugs had been tested, they actually found something like 38 different compounds. Yeah. So it just shows really the amount of different substances that have been identified within basically one believed drug, which was Valium. And actually from all of those samples, of the 1,200 samples, only 45% contained Valium. So actually the vast majority, 55%, didn't contain Valium. They contained other forms of benzos. What's the issue with that then? What harms ultimately can come from that?
Well, purely and simply that we don't know the long-term effects of these newer research kind of chemicals, which are quite commonly represent or very much look like the blue, all blue tablets, which we tend to see now all look alike. But when looking at the actual content, they differ dramatically. So we're having to kind of broadly taper our harm reduction messaging to incorporate that. One, you don't know what you're taking, and you've got to think about colloquially our language as well. Benzos, MSGs. There's so many different terms. Valiums, so many different terms are used for.
Also dog Valium as well.
Yeah, or dog Valiums back in the day as well. Yeah. That was something else that was, when we saw the marketplaces becoming more, should we say, more difficult, more challenging to kind of purchase those substances. Then we saw, apparently dog Valium coming into play, which I think was just applied from that kind of back in the day when we when you could buy bath salts and not for human consumption and all the rest of it, and they were just labelled that. But we are having to broaden our harm reduction information and messaging to incorporate all the substances. So it's been a vital part for us as frontline workers to make sure that we keep up to date from a huge resource which is welcomed so much from our perspective from the Wedinos platform, being able to make sure that we stay on top of the information, and the way in which it delivers that kind of data to us locally from area to area. We can kind of see then what the trends are looking like. But you've got to remember that could be then there's a bit of a delay from when the test is sent to when it's actually get the results, and when it's published, the drug can change again. So it's not flawless, but we have to really educate the people on the streets, people who are using substances behind closed doors, that there's lots of challenges in regards to not knowing the longer term effects. And some of the adulterants, for want of a better word, that can contaminate those substances can also be quite harmful as well. And I think that is it's imperative that drug and alcohol workers are stay on top of their knowledge and keep themselves up to date so that they can be champions of the harm reduction messaging when it comes to then the use of these kind of substances going forward.
Yeah, and also I guess one of the big ones is in terms of dosage, isn't it?
Yeah.
With regards, I always remember when Atizolam came on the scene, which is probably going back a few years now, and that being within the benzo family, but that's kind of seen as 10 times stronger more potent than kind of like your usual Valium, so therefore, but also it can look very similar to like you said, like the blue tablets that you would traditionally know as like Valium. They could also look very similar to that. So actually, on the face of it, if you just had them in the palm of your hand, you wouldn't have a clue, really. But then, if one's 10 times stronger than the other, then obviously you need to dose appropriately really with that. And I always remember in Scotland, it must have been like 2018, 2019. It was definitely just before the pandemic anyway. And I think their drug-related deaths hit just over 1,000 for like the first time. Maybe it hit over 1,000 maybe the year before. But ultimately, I think they found that atizolam was implicated in something like 800 of those deaths, which just showed like the massive issue that ultimately these drugs were causing, and obviously that one in particular. I'm not even going to mention like the other kind of novel benzos, as we term it, so kind of like newer benzos, and they're not necessarily new in terms of its actual production, but just new within the recreational kind of drug scene and the market, isn't it? But I can't even say half of their names, to be honest with you, so I'm not even going to like attempt to even kind of say them really with it. But would you say, in terms of I know we've touched on, like, I think we probably touched on it in a previous episode around the whole issue around synthetic opioids potentially coming onto the market, and it's actually an episode we're going to look at in a couple of weeks in relation to the ban of opium in Afghanistan, and what implications that's going to have on the drugs market in the UK. But thinking of the risk that is posed by synthetic opioids, is benzos as big a concern, if not more, would you say?
Potentially, like we're saying, like if we go back to what we were saying at the beginning, you know, their use is far more broader and wider, and probably the diverse population that are using, experimenting, or having a symbiotic relationship with the drug is really important to factor into this. And I think, you know, going back to all the other evidence that we've kind of presented from a anecdotal perspective, I think what we have seen is, you know, taking atizolam as your example, is obviously because it's an analog of a benzodiazepine, we maybe fortunately be able to take that approach and of treating like a benzodiazepine, obviously making individuals aware of its potency, its half-life effects, making people aware of the dosaging, and being mindful of, like, you know, the time taken to when they feeling they're needing to redose. So we've been able to adapt then, you know, the use of, you know, everyone goes back to the Bible of the Ashton manual when it comes to managing benzodiazepine, which kind of like features and factors in how they work and how to withdraw. So that's my go-to every time. So if I use a broad stick, but like work on the basis of, right, they fall within this analog of a benzodiazepine, then I can then vary my approach to working with the individual and what kind of information and advice I would be given, but always kind of with that precursor of, you know, we don't know exactly what you're taking, but we're going to use going on what your presentation is, what you're retelling me of your experience of this current batch which you're currently using. So we'll use that as a reference point, and also if we're lucky to be able to obtain samples and we can send it off. That for me is our kind of safety net, but it's not, should we say, it's not foolproof. You know, it's just not something that we can definitely rule out that they're not other research chemicals or alternative substances which could even be even more harmful or toxic to that individual. So we still got to err on the side of caution. We still always got to err on that side of caution, which we've got to kind of highlight and emphasize to that individual. And
yeah. Do you know, going back in terms of what you said, like you have you've kind of like adapted your harm reduction messages in terms of that you don't know what you're taking.
Yeah.
Are those like harm reduction? It's purely out of interest, really. Are those, because I can't really remember, but were we given that kind of harm reduction advice like 5, maybe I'd say probably 10, 15
maybe
years
longer.
ago?
I think it's longer now, because I think if you think back to when we had like such substances such as methadone come in on the scene, I think that was that was the game changer. That was the drug that kind of really highlighted a change in drug availability, drug use, and seeing like and from our own personal experiences of working in a street agency, how that changed the landscape even for opiate users, and how that had a brief kind of like foray with the drug, because it was accessible, it was cheap, it stopped the withdrawals, but it actually created bedlam, people's mental health, people injecting practices quadrupled in a day, really poor practice, the sharing of needles, chaos ensued, and our backs were up against the wall, but it was a kick up the backside for drug and alcohol services to realise that drugs were changing, people were changing, people were looking for different substances, whether that is forced because of cost or availability, but it showed how it could have a huge impact on what we were delivering at that time. So that was almost like a proverbial heads up to see this is what the future could hold for us. And I think that's what we should be kind of like aware of now with the scene that we've got with benzodiazepines at the moment, or substances or analogues of that ilk. And I think that's what's important, is that we should never take for granted that we've always had it quite easy with the famous 5 drugs that traditionally were all too commonplace over the many years. That is no longer the case. We see and hear what is happening in other countries, and we're fortunate not to have that level of challenges due to our Medicines Act and all those kind of things, and the culture, I suppose, from a health perspective. But we've got to be mindful of that could potentially be us in X amount of years, due to the marketplace being almost primed for that, for those replacement drugs, because people are going, and always will be or seem to be, wanting to look for those substances.
Yeah. Was it then, because obviously methadone came on the scene, what was it, like 2012, was it?
I think it was before that, because even when we were doing events, remember we were saying, so Rob and I, when we were younger, with hair as well.
I definitely had
hair. I had hair as well.
No.
Did I not?
No, I don't think I ever saw you with your curly.
Oh, right. Okay.
You had a perm, didn't you?
Yeah, they were the good days. But I think it was like, one of the examples is like, when we were doing welfare at events, and we hardly had anyone coming into welfare that were using our traditional drugs. They were coming to us after buying, as they were calling it, herbal highs, and we were like, what is this about? Why are these people? And I gotta admit, I was very judgmental and thought maybe it was because of the individual, because the individual's expectation was, or want was, I'm not going to use those illegal drugs, they're dangerous, I'll just use these safer drugs. But in fact, they were stronger, and they were then overwhelmed, shall we say, by the actual herbal high, legal highs. And still, we were just a little bit like, this is really bizarre. I remember doing one night shift and going, this is really bizarre. Everyone has come in has actually bought substances from that stall across the way, and it turned out then potentially that they were using methadone and other substances, and and that for me was the time, was the dawn of the awakening from my perspective, because it made me look into then obviously my practice and how I worked within harm reduction, give me the boot up the backside to look into these substances. And when looking into it and seeing the impact that they were having and the potential that it had to replace traditional drugs, and we, alongside the availability through the internet, which we were sort of seeing growing massively, it was a huge game changer, and that I think that was like, for me, was the foundation of that preparation of now we need to really kind of up our game, and how do we become more accessible to people, not just working with the group of people that we have been known to, say, statutory services, health services, criminal justice. Now the game changer was these people now that were using these substances were from a much wider demographic than we as a street drug agency had seen before.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that time for quite some time, but actually reflecting back on it now, it was such a mad time. Like, just the whole scenario around it, from your head shops to just being able to get it so easily accessible. Kind of the main message I always remember was like, legal does not mean safe. It's mad how we had to do that. But like, prior to that then, because I know spice, synthetic cannabinoids, they first emerged in 2009, but I know we didn't see that for a little while. I think methadone hit first. But before that then, was it a case of if people were taking benzos, they were taking benzos? If they were taking heroin, they were taking heroin, pretty much. So it's kind of not as what we kind of know it now, really, in terms of like bringing it back to benzos then, in that if they believe that they're taking Valium, then actually it's a 50-50 chance of whether actually it contains Valium or not, really, from that.
And like I say, it depends on where you are in the country, and it depends on what kind of like, routes or transportation routes of the drugs coming into, that can really dictate on what you're actually taking. And because it's so broad and so varied, as I said, you have to take this generic approach sometimes. In an ideal world, on-site drug testing, being able to give someone that information, advice there and then in the now, is an ideal scenario from a harm reduction perspective. So I've just, give the scenario of I've just gone and bought myself now, I've spent 30 quid on a bunch of blue tabs. I can come down, I can get them tested and get told what the actual active ingredients are, and I know there's always, it's not always perfect, right? Because dosages from tablet to tablet, depending on how well produced that those tablets are, do change drastically. But it's the best that we're going to get, from a drug check-in perspective, but that would be our gold standard, shall we say, for the future going forward.
I was going to ask you, like, in terms of, I guess, to kind of wrap this up, one, what are we doing to try and reduce the harm in terms of like what we're currently seeing, but then on the flip side of that, what needs to happen, what needs to be implemented, for example, to basically overcome this whole issue around benzos and the issue around not necessarily knowing what you're getting.
And I know without sounding like a broken record, right? Full spectrum harm reduction is required. Right?
I love that,
right?
You need to get that into your self-proclaimed title somewhere.
But I can't, because I think it's someone else has owned that, and I totally agree. I think when mentioning the word like drug checking, it's synonymous with events and festivals and stimulants or disassociatives. That needs to be an offer for everyone, so even if you're using heroin, if you're using benzos, you need to be able to have access to a drug check. And I think we've got to be wiser to the approach that we need to take, and take a good note, take away best practice from such things as I once again refer to the Ashton manual. But one of the key elements along that is that kind of like, what supportive measures can the individual or us as an organisation can provide for the person accessing support. And I think like recommendations for like for managing their withdrawal symptoms would be including like right down to what do they their diet, the nutrition aspect of that diet, their lifestyle changes which are required to ensure a positive outcome from from a harm reduction perspective, because we're not just talking about abstinence. We're just talking to someone who want to maintain their drug use and how they get the full benefits of their drug use as well. And how then we can help them, I suppose, ultimately to support them through the whole withdrawal process and the feelings and emotions that they've got to deal with at the end, or during that roller coaster, but also at the other end of the tunnel, and what additional services can be brought in to be able to support them. And I think that for me is what kind of like the terminology from that full spectrum harm reduction is, like incorporating all drugs and not just those. The fundamental core of like harm reduction was built on the needle exchange, HIV agenda, injecting practices and all that. It's encompassing it all, so it's not just the drugs that are injected, it's the ones that are swallowed, snorted, and drunk, and I think that's what's really important from our perspective going forward.
I just see, in terms of there being so much emphasis on other substances at the minute, I'm a little bit worried in terms of from a benzo and a couple of other substances as well, that they're kind of being left behind really in terms of people's proactiveness to try and limit the damage ultimately from that. And, I go back in terms of synthetic opioids, and quite rightly, that is near the top of the agenda for many, but I think, like you said, to kind of ultimately trying to incorporate all substances is pivotal really with it. So, cool. Yeah. Is there anything else, Jim?
Keep it real.
Lovely. Cool. So if there's any other topics you guys would like us to discuss, we got quite a few episodes coming up in the next coming weeks. They'll be released over the next few months, because we do actually have full-time jobs in addition to doing this podcast as well, so we try and get it out there as frequently as possible. But let us know if there's any other kind of topics you'd like us to discuss, but until next time, we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Like and subscribe.
That was the absolute business, Jay.
If you've been affected by the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out to your local GP, or you can call the Samaritans for free on 116 123. Barod is a charity that supports anybody affected by alcohol and other drug use, including friends and family members. So if you're based in South, West or East Wales and would like to access our services, or yourself, or gain information for a loved one, please visit our website at barod.cymru, and you can chat to a trained support worker 7 days a week via our live web chat service.